Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back. Today we're going to look at Gurtogg Bloodboil. This is typically the 6th boss that you'll encounter inside the Black Temple, and while he doesn't have too many mechanics, it is a bit of a step up in comparison to the previous bosses, and it can be very punishing if not dealt with correctly. This is the 2-phase encounter that requires more healing than the previous bosses, as well as some finicky tanking, and most importantly, positioning will be key. With that being said though, if you get a full understanding of how the fight works, you guys should have no issues with this, so let's get started. Before we start, please note that this footage, as well as all the damage values and mechanics, are from PTR. Blizzard has since stated that they will not be tuning the raid at all, so we should be safe to expect the encounters to work relatively the same. If for some reason Blizzard does in fact tune any of the encounters, I will make an updated guide for that boss immediately. I know that some of you guys prefer a written form of this guide, and for those, there'll be a link to the Google Doc in the description. It's just this script though. Lastly, before we begin, I stream 5 days a week over on Twitch in the guild Insidious on the server at Faralina. Please feel free to stop by whenever for any questions or just hang out and meet some new friends. We really are a family over there, and we love TBC. You can find us over at twitch.tv/CrixGaming_. And lastly, if you wouldn't mind clicking that red subscribe button so it turns gray, that'd be dope. Thanks. Alright, first off, let's talk about raid comp. For this fight, I suggest 3 tanks. Which class of tanks doesn't matter much. You could technically run 2 tanks, but it's kind of dangerous because they have one mechanic that makes you tank swap, but you also have another mechanic that disorients and another mechanic that knocks the current tank back as well as reduces that threat. It's usually how you tank swap. But if you get bad RNG, you can have one tank get the swap and the other get the disorient, thus the boss would then need to be picked up by the 3rd tank. I also suggest to bring 7 healers or 6 with a strong off healer to help with the phase 2 transition. This is one of the more healing intensive fights inside the Black Temple, and while some guilds might not need the 7th healer, we use 7 on the first kill and then 6.5 on the second kill. So once again, that's up to you. But as always, it's better to be safe than sorry. Fill the rest of the raid with your pumper DPS and let's begin. Alright my friends, next up is the most important part of this fight, and that's positioning. In phase 1, there's not much this raid needs to worry about besides of course the main mechanic, which is actually named after the boss, Bloodboil. What this does is every 10 seconds you'll put a debuff on the furthest 5 targets from the boss that does roughly 500 to 600 damage per tick for 24 seconds, which isn't that bad at all, and it can actually be healed through with relative ease. The problem is that it stacks, meaning the same group of 5 people should not take the next set of blood boils. So to counter this, you must have 3 groups of 5 set up ahead of time, with each of them knowing their orders. After you sort out 3 groups, simply have one group start in the back with an emphasis on them being the furthest 5 raid members away from the boss. Once Bloodboil goes out, have the first group move back up to the raid, while the second group falls back to catch this next set of Bloodboils. Once they expire, they move back up to the raid, and the third group steps back to catch the next set of Bloodboils. Repeat that until 5 sets of Bloodboils go out, and then phase 2 will begin. As for the groups themselves, it's suggested to just use your groups that you already have to make it less confusing. For example, we use the Hunter group as the first set of soakers, the Mage group for the second set of soakers, and the Warlock group for the third set of soakers. Note that you should not have melee soaking, as it makes no sense to have them running back and forth. So depending on your Hunter group, leave the enhancement, feral, or whatever melee is in that group on the boss, and just have a healer come soak with the Hunters instead. This can be confusing at first, so to help out, mark one person in each of the 3 groups to act as a follow marker, and then have one person in the raid call out which group needs to go out for the blood boils. Okay, now that you got the positions handled, let's talk about the rest of the phase. As I said, we handled the hardest part of the phase. Now let's touch on the tanks, because outside of the blood boils, there's not much to do otherwise. Threat is huge, and this fight is one of those annoying ones where you need to have all 3 of your tanks be the highest threat at all times, for a lot of the same reasons as Void Reaver, meaning all of your DPS need to remain behind all 3 tanks on the threat meter. It sounds easy, but you know how DPS are.
All they want to do is zug.
A huge emphasis on having the tanks maintaining the aggro, because throughout this phase they'll just be bouncing threat in between all 3 of them thanks to acidic wound, which does about 270 nature damage every 2 seconds, but also more importantly it reduces your tank's armor by 500 per tick and it stacks to 60. As you can imagine, this can grow to dangerous levels. We typically have all the tanks keep up a couple stacks so they can keep up some threat and simply tank swap when this happens until the debuff drops, and it shouldn't be an issue. The issue is that Gurtogg is also taunt immune. So usually after a tank gets about 7 to 10 stacks, he stops attacking and lets the second tank pass him on threat. If your tanks are having issues tank swapping, you can bop the tank to force the swap as well. An almost foolproof way would be to simply let whichever tank has a threat to eat and eject, which will knock him back and reduce his threat, allowing a clean tank swap. It's also important that all 3 tanks be conscious about each other's stacks of acidic wound and the threat levels at all times. In a perfect world, all 3 tanks are close to each other in threat, making the swaps even cleaner. As stated earlier, the 3rd tank is pretty much only needed if one of the other 2 tanks gets disoriented by Bewildering Strike. As for the healers, it's suggested to have 2 healers spamming into the main tank, 2 healers covering the off tanks, and the rest covering the raid and the mini blood boils that'll be going off. You should save all your cooldowns for phase 2, as that's the most healing intensive phase as well. As for the DPS, the range needs to prioritize successfully moving to and from with their groups to handle the blood boil debuff. The melee DPS need to simply sit behind the boss and pump while also trying to avoid 2 frontals, one being Arcing Smash and the other one being Fell Acid Breath, which he will target a random melee DPS and do roughly 3 to 4k on hit, while also leaving a slow ticking dot which does a decent amount of damage to anyone in a frontal cone of the boss. Lastly, during phase 1, it is of the utmost importance for all the DPS in the raid to remain behind all 3 tanks in terms of threat. After the 5th Blood Boil, phase 2 will begin. While phase 2 is much simpler than phase 1, it's also much more dangerous than phase 1, and it's going to be where most guilds wipe in my opinion. At the start of phase 2, the boss immediately gets a super buff called Fell Rage, which increases his damage by 85%, and he will also gain a stacking debuff called Fury that increases his attack speed by 8% and stacks during the entirety of phase 2. Not only that, but he will fixate on one random raid member, making that person his Fell Rage target. They also get a buff that increases their health by 250%, their armor by roughly 7,000, their damage by 300%, and will also double the player size. The Fell Rage target will be the one tanking the boss for the entirety of phase 2, and they will need to be healed extremely hard because not only do they have to deal with Fell Rage, but the boss starts phase 2 by casting Fell Geyser, making the boss sprint to the fixated target and instantly deal 3.5 thousand damage to everybody around the target as well as knocking them back. You can help mitigate this raid damage by making sure nobody is around the Fell Rage target. However, this is kind of hard to predict, so it's smart to even start spreading out after the 4th Blood Boil, while the 5th group stays back to catch that last wave of boils. And just to top it off, the boss does 2 frontal attacks. He'll still be doing Fell Acid Breath, but he will also add in Fell Arcing Smash, which does the exact same thing as Arcing Smash from phase 1, except it only hits the Fell Rage target. For all these reasons, every single healer should be spamming into the Fell Rage target as much as they can, as there shouldn't be much damage going out after the phase gets established. Lastly with this phase is Insignificance, which everyone in the raid gets besides the Fell Rage target. Save your lust and all your DPS cooldowns for this phase just for this reasons, and you guys will not have to worry about any threat at all and can just pump. Please note that this debuff can be resisted, so make sure that you have the debuff before super pumping. 30 seconds later, he will go back into phase 1, and you repeat this process until the boss is dead. It is very important that going back into phase 1 that all DPS stop DPS as it's a threat wipe, and you need to let all 3 tanks establish their threat again. Not only that, but make sure the tanks are back in their original pooling position, as well as the first set of Blood Boil soakers, as 10 seconds after phase 1 starts again, he will cast the first set of soakers. The encounter goes back and forth from phase 1 to phase 2 until the boss dies. As for the tanks in phase 2, if the Fell Rage target dies, threat continues as it was in phase 1, and whoever is in the lead on threat will be tanking. This will more than likely mean a wipe since the boss is still buffed and will decimate your tank. So be ready and be quick to pop whatever you can to survive if the fixate target dies. Note that while Ice Block, Vanish, Bop, and Feign Death all will drop the Fell Rage, however it pushes back the threat to the tank as we just mentioned, so it's suggested to not use anything to drop the fixate and just do everything you can to survive. As for the healers, you guys got your word cut out. The transition into phase 2 is one of the most dangerous transitions in the entire raid. After the 5th Blood Boil in phase 1 goes out, 15 total raid members will have the Blood Boil debuff. At the same time, the Fell Rage target will be getting absolutely destroyed, all while the tanks still have their dot stacks from acidic wounds. As soon as phase 2 begins, pop your healing cooldowns. All tank healers immediately swap to the Fell Rage target and spam into him with everything you got. Meanwhile, the other healers focus on keeping the remaining Blood Boil targets alive. As for the Fell Rage target, make sure that you can see target to target in a literal second he starts targeting you. It is very important that when he charges, you hold still and the DPS move away from you. Otherwise, you can just be running Fell Geysers into other people. At this point, you want to pop everything you have to keep yourself alive. You should have a health stone, and since you were saving cooldowns for phase 2, you should have your potion cooldown. And if you need to pop a health potion, you should. You can also use Scrolls of Protection, which is about 2% armor reduction, and Iron Shield potions for some extra armor, as well as Nightmare Seeds if needed. Anything that can help you mitigate or reduce the amount of damage you're about to take. Pretty much every class has something they can do to help themselves survive, even if it's a small help. Druids can Bark Skin and go Bear for not only the takingness, but also for Frenzy Regen. Hunters can Aspect a Monkey while meleeing, remember not to feign death. Mages can Ice Barrier, however no mage should be Frost at this point, so they should really only have Mana Shield while using instant cast spells like Fire Blast and Ice Lance. Remember not to Ice Block though. Side note on mages, you guys can cast Amplify Magic on everyone in the raid to help out with some extra heals. Priest, you can bubble yourself with Power Word Shield, Renew Palm, make sure Inner Fire is on, which is huge for armor, and then Shadow Priest specifically can use Vampiric Embrace, and 100% make sure that you do not Shadow Word Death. All specs of Priest should spam heal themselves if targeted. Rogues have it the easiest, just pop Evasion, Blade Fury, and Pump. Do not vanish. And Shamans immediately put a shield on. Enhancement Shamans can use Shamanistic Rage, and Restless Shamans can use Earth Shield. All specs of Shamans should spam heal themselves if targeted. Warlocks, you guys can Death Coil immediately for health gain from it, and then start spamming Drain Life. And lastly, Warriors, simply put on a shield and go into defensive stance. Well guys, I think I covered it all. I always at the end of these feel like I'm missing something, but you know, it's kind of hard to get everything. I hope I don't, even though you guys will let me know if I do, right? I hope I'm not missing anything anyway. And more importantly, I sincerely hope you guys enjoyed this and that it helps you prepare for an overall outstanding raid tier. Please like the video if you liked it. Think about subscribing to the channel while you're there. Good luck, everyone. I'll see you in the next one.
Peace.